Okay.
Recording in progress. Got it. Excellent. Hello. Hi. Thanks everybody for coming to this talk. My name is Josh, and I work at a company called Rec Room, which is a formerly VR, now very cross-platform game. And so, big thank you to Mitchell and to Ari for having me here to come talk to you all and share a little bit of sort of my story and the Rec Room story and a little bit of advice about making these sort of cross-platform games. I put together a pretty brief little PowerPoint deck that I mostly just had a lot of fun making. But I got a bunch of time for questions sort of at the end. So let's do it. This talk is how Rec Room went cross-platform. But first, there we go. Who am I? So I went to Michigan, like I assume most of you. I graduated from the College of Engineering back in 2013 with a degree in computer science. And after that, I spent a couple of years working at Microsoft. I had some internships there and I worked on some Xbox games. So I had sort of the good opportunity to work there during the launch of the Xbox One and be a part of that platform launch and see a couple of sort of early Xbox One games go out the door. I mostly worked on like analytics and sort of support engineering for these things like Rise and Sunset Overdrive. And after I did that for a few years, I had a really cool opportunity to move over and work in R&D, sort of on incubation for the HoloLens project. So before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about Magic Leap and other AR devices that are coming out and have been coming out. HoloLens, if you're not familiar, is Microsoft's AR headset. And so Microsoft was working on this for a really long time. And they had a couple of internal studios that were making basically games and apps for the HoloLens during sort of initial development of the hardware to make sure that when, hey, this thing releases, it will actually be possible to make a compelling game or whatever. So I spent a couple of years there working on this thing called RoboRaid, which was a pretty fun project that we did where you actually wore the AR headset and it would scan your room and it would detect where walls are. And then we would spawn all these waves of terrifying robotic aliens that would burst through your wall and shoot lasers at you. And you had to duck and dive and all that kind of stuff. And it was a super fun project. A lot of interesting and challenging problems to work through. If you've ever used a HoloLens One, you'll know that the input is not particularly robust. You had only a couple of things to work with. You could move your head around. You could do this little gesture. And that was kind of it. So, this was a slightly jazzed up version of the demo that we did for a Microsoft press conference back in 2015 or something like that. But did that for a couple of years, and that was a lot of fun. And then when the HoloLens One first launched, I decided alongside a couple of my colleagues from that team to leave Microsoft and try starting our own company, which is what Rec Room is. And before I go into more details about Rec Room, I've kind of got a little video just to sort of show what this thing is. The company's called Rec Room, the game's called Rec Room. Check out this little video and then we'll talk some more. And there's no audio because, sorry, but there are subtitles. So, and pretend that there's just like a really bumping soundtrack on. Pizza party, whoa, it's my kind of party. What do you love about Rec Room? Wow, building games. This is one of our trailers we released for Steam or the App Store, something like that. But basically, what you're seeing in here is a sort of collection of stuff that people do in the game, which, we think of basically falling into three buckets. So we think Rec Room is this social cross-platform game full of user-created content where you kind of do one of three things. You socialize with your friends. Oh, no. You socialize with your friends. You hang out. You're having a pizza party. You're having a birthday party. People have gotten married and had their reception. All kinds of stuff. You play fun games together. We made some games for it. The community's made a lot of games. And then you can create. And so you can kind of see here, this person is making a really incredible dragon statue. And so depending on your interests, there's something for kind of everybody in Rec Room, but you're generally doing one of these three things: socializing, playing, and creating. Okay, fun pictures, excellent. But so that's sort of our external public facing version of this. This is what the game is the kind of stuff you do here. In 2021, Rec Room looks a lot different than it did when we first launched many years ago. And so this is sort of the way that we think about Rec Room internally. We think of this as really an online social community. This is where lots of people come and hang out. All these friends that are socializing and getting married, they're part of the Rec Room community. They exist together. Their friendships, their friend graph exists together in a way that it doesn't anywhere else. And we really want this to be a community that's welcoming for anybody and everybody. We also care a lot about what we call simple social UGC. You'll see that a lot of games companies, tech companies have inscrutable acronyms all the time. So UGC, if you're not familiar, is user-generated content. Basically, it means the stuff you see in the game, like if I go back to this trailer, is made by other players. So let's see if we get a good example. Like here, this crazy underwater adventure entirely made by people who play the game in the game using game mechanics. No Roblox editor, no Unity, no Blender, using the game mechanics. And that's one of the things we think is really unique about Rec Room. So here, let's go back to this shot here, this sort of San Francisco scene. There's motion, there's logic, there's spaces, there's models, there's all kinds of stuff. There's all the pieces you need to build sort of a full-fledged game, but they're accessible to players in the game, cooperatively playing together. So we think about this simple social UGC. It's not just about being able to make things. It's about expanding the set of people who are capable of making things, don't need to install another app. It's also about social creation. Mitchell and I can work together and make something, and he can do the programming and I can do the animating, and together we can create something bigger and better than we could each make on our own. And it's just fun, right? It combines with this desire to have this fun and welcoming community. And then lastly, we think about Rec Room as being cross-platform. So again, this is Rec Room 2021, cross-platform. What we mean is we don't just want people to be able to play Rec Room in VR. We want people to play Rec Room on as many devices as possible. What we want is for someone to invite their friend to play with them. And we don't want there to be a barrier of entry of, oh, I don't have a $1,500 PC from a couple of years ago, a $300 Oculus Quest, whatever it might be. I have my iPhone. We'd love to make it possible for that person to play Rec Room with their friend and then make more friends and kind of grow the community like that. So the way we think about this is, we want this big welcoming community I was talking about that's making all kinds of cool stuff to grow to encompass as many kinds of different game playing platforms as possible. And then lastly, in 2021, a big piece is that we are a venture-backed company. And so we're really proud to be sort of the first VR software unicorn, which is a company valued at over $1 billion. And that's a big validation of sort of our strategy and the work that we've done so far. But it all kind of boils down into this kind of big thing. It's this giant community, lots and lots of players, lots and lots of platforms, millions and millions of rooms and creations and objects and games that people have made, all kinds of stuff. Feels very, very big. But it didn't start very, very big. It started very, very small. Rec Room first came out about 5 years ago. We shipped in 2016, and we shipped the very first version of the game in like 3 months, from sort of zero to up on Steam. We were a really small team. That group that left from HoloLens was just 6 people. We hired a couple before we got up onto Steam, but we went into early access at the end of June, and we literally founded the company in April. And at the time, it was really tiny. What you could do in Rec Room was just a really tiny sliver of what you can do in there today. All this stuff, almost none of that actually existed. We started really, 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 really small. And we've gotten here by updating the game like almost literally every week since then. And so here's a goofy little GIF where I was just scrolling through our updates on Steam this morning, trying to see like, well, how many have we had? And it was just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And some of these are small, little bug fix here and there. Some of them are giant, like now you can play without a VR headset, like, yeah, and kind of everything in between. But we've been super, super, super iterative, and we have built on top of the successes that we've been able to make to grow bigger and bigger. And that really kind of stems from the way that we think about games and product and design and all this kind of stuff, which is basically that at the end of the day, we really have these sort of 3 pillars to our strategy, and they're reflected in sort of the way that we've built this game, and they've built up to sort of the success that we've been able to find. But it really kind of starts with these 3 things, which I'll come back to and touch on kind of again and again throughout our chat. And the first one is we always start with goals. And, okay, sure, it's easy enough to sort of agree with that. I personally, as at the start of my career, didn't really appreciate sort of the power of goal setting explicitly. Sort of like, yeah, sure, this is what I want to do. Okay, great. But honestly, it really is important that you get really good at clearly understanding and articulating what you're actually trying to do. Because what I've personally found, what our team has found time and again, is that when projects don't go well, it typically is because multiple people are collaborating in different directions. There's a saying that our creative director has, which I really love, which is the opposite of vision is not no vision, it's multiple competing visions. People that make games aren't here because it's whatever, I don't really care, it's just a paycheck kind of job. They're really passionate people, right? It's people that are super excited about this thing. You're trying to bring something into existence. And so you have all of these creative people that are trying to do their best work. But when you have 2 really strong forces pulling in opposite directions, you don't actually make any progress. So by starting with goals and being really clear about, hey, what are we as a group? What are we as a team? What is this project trying to accomplish? Then you can do a better job of making sure that when those 2 passionate people are putting a bunch of effort in, they're pushing in the same direction broadly and able to make progress together. Anyway, I'll come back to this later. But so this is sort of the way we think about it. We start with goals all the time, and then we really believe in iteration, in getting something to a good enough state, and then measuring whether it was successful, and then sort of trying again. And I think that this process of updating the game every week for 5.5 years is a really clear reflection of that. Because what it means is that we don't have to pretend to be geniuses. We don't have to pretend to know what the right version of this game is going to be in 4 years. We can kind of figure it out along the way. And so the more that you're able to iterate, the more you're able to identify what works, what doesn't work, what resonates, what doesn't resonate, and do more of the good and less the bad. So it's absolutely a skill to get good at this, to identify ways to take, kind of a minimal step forward and then reevaluate and kind of course correct. But that course correction is super, super valuable. And a big part of that course correction is just listening to the people that are going to play your game. This isn't necessarily always easy or always possible, depending on the kind of project you're working on. We're very fortunate to be an online, always on game where we've had players that have played nonstop for years. So it's relatively straightforward for us to get feedback from the community through analytics or just asking people or user testing or something. But as you do these iterations, it really is important that you find a way to hold yourself accountable and get actual credible takeaways and results so that your next iteration is honest and productive and not just something else. Anyway, so this really is our strategy for doing anything at Rec Room. We always start with goals. We really focus on iteration. We think that the more iterations we can get in, the better the end result's going to be. And then we really listen to our players. So how did we apply these things? This is what I kind of want to build to. we're at this place here, really proud of this, really excited about how big the game is, how popular it is, how many creations there are in there, how cross-platform it is. But that was a long journey of applying this strategy again and again and again. So let's kind of go on that journey together. All right, here we go. So I've got a slide for every year. This is 2016. We launch midway through the year, and we come out and we are exclusively playable on Steam VR, basically just with an HTC Vive. So to kind of paint a picture for you, Rec Room at that time was kind of the Wii Sports of VR. So it's sort of a collection of kind of physical, simple mini games. We launched with stuff like dodgeball and disc golf and what we called paddleball, basically, ping pong. But sort of simple games that really took advantage of having these tracked motion controllers. Because at the time, the Vive was brand new. It had come out a couple of months before Rec Room launched. And the Oculus Rift touch controllers weren't even out yet. They came with an Xbox gamepad. So it was actually not possible to play Rec Room when the Oculus Rift first came out. We had to wait until the end of the year when the touch controllers finally shipped. But we were VR only, Steam VR only, really on these sort of high-end VR platforms. And it was kind of just an experiment, honestly, because what we knew at the time was, hey, we're a group of people that have been working in XR for a number of years, shipping games for HoloLens, having done lots and lots of internal prototypes and projects. We have a lot of experience relative sort of the broader community making and building and shipping this kind of immersive gameplay experience. So we knew we wanted to do something in the sort of XR space. People didn't use the term XR at the time, but that's what it was. And we knew we wanted to do something that had this sort of potential to grow dramatically over time because we wanted to get sort of venture funding to support our business. And a kind of common, the understanding at the time was if you're going to raise sort of venture capital, you need to be able to communicate your business more like a platform than an individual game. It's hard to see how something like God of War on the PS4 can make more money next year than it did this year. The traditional game that ships makes the traditional AAA game makes most of its money back when it first comes out, and then makes less and less and less and less over time, and it accumulates. But you're going to get most of your sales immediately, and it's sort of a tail down from that, which is really not the form that sort of a lot of venture capital firms are interested in pursuing. Whereas if you have something that's more like a platform, like a Netflix or something, like Netflix makes more money every year than it did the previous year. And so we knew we wanted to do something that was going to take advantage of our skills in XR, but also was able to be fundable because we needed to be paid. So Rec Room was sort of our answer to that. It's these fun physicalized games. There's a collection of them kind of sewn together by this sort of social space. That was our way of making it kind of a platform. It's possible to add more of these mini games over time, which is exactly what we did. Over the next year, we added a bunch more. We found sort of richer games that people resonated better with. So we had these things called our quests that are these sort of little cooperative dungeon crawlers that were more of a reason to spend time with your friends. Where dodgeball maybe sort of is a one and done kind of game. You might have some strategy. When you've got an hour-long difficult quest that really you want to play through with your friends or your buddy or whatever, then you have much more reason to make friends and to invite them and to all these kinds of things. And so we really focused on expanding the set of games that we added to Rec Room, but we also sort of saw one surprising signal come out of the community. So going back to that strategy I mentioned of listening to our players, we started to see players trying to make things. We saw them going into our games like paintball and trying to make it into something else. which we didn't make very easy for them. They wanted to play games like hide and seek. But, our annoying voiceover in the room is like, we should really start the game. And there's nothing you could do to turn that off. They're just trying to play hide and seek amidst sort of all of this noise. And so we had this realization of like, oh, duh, instead of actively getting in their way, what if we actively supported them? So we started to kind of dip our toes into like, well, all right, we've got all these props and stuff that we've used for our rooms. These cooperative dungeon crawlers are filled with all kinds of stone walls and buckets and barrels and whatever. But if we just let players spawn them, and then, VR motion controls are really expressive. It's really pretty easy to place those objects and save the room. And so we did that. And you can see this in this GIF here of this make your own clubhouse. We invested in stuff like what we call the maker pen. It's basically like a little tool for spawning objects. And we started to kind of dip our toes into imagining what Rec Room would be like if we were not the only people making content for it, which sort of reinforced this idea of being a platform. It's not that's a meaningful transition to go from we only have Netflix originals to it's Netflix originals and content made by other production studios. So that was in our second year. And then we did one more big thing, which is that we launched on PSVR. So we made this transition from being PC only to also being on console, which was surprisingly challenging, actually, because a PlayStation 4 is really not as powerful as a beefy PC that hit the minimum specs for playing an Oculus Rift when it launched. And so there was a surprising amount of work involved in getting it to run on PlayStation. But we did it, and it was super worth it. A huge percentage of our audience at this point in time came from PlayStation. There was really nothing like Rec Room on PlayStation at the time. And so that was a really, really good investment. Moving on. 2018, we're now 2 years into Rec Room existing. And what we found at the time is, hey, we were on more or less every major VR device that was in the market. This was that sort of lull before the first Quest came out. And what we found was that our attach rate was actually really high. And so attach rate, if you're not familiar with that term, is the percentage of people who own a device or that are participating in a platform who have purchased or downloaded a title, a piece of software. So it would be of all the people that have Xboxes, what percentage of them are playing Halo or bought Halo? And so for us, it was of all the people that have Steam VR accounts or are an Oculus Rift or a PlayStation VR, what percentage of them have downloaded and tried Rec Room? And we got to a really high number that we were super proud of. But what we found was that at that point, there kind of wasn't anyone left to get to play Rec Room. And so there's all kinds of work we can do to make the experience of playing and the capabilities that someone has better. But again, we are at this point this sort of venture-backed company, and the implication when you take that kind of financing is that you need to grow your business. And so we needed to find a way to get more players into the game. That was the primary mechanism by which we were demonstrating growth, is the number of people that were playing and the amount of time that they're spending playing. And so we sort of had this realization, in part inspired by the success of things like VR chat, to pursue a non-VR version of the game. And so in 2018, we shipped what we called Screens Mode as kind of an experimental feature. And so you can see in this GIF here, that's one of our cooperative dungeon crawlers where you play a sort of a swashbuckling pirate. That's an actual screen capture from the game. It was sort of this over-the-shoulder, kind of third-person Gears of War-like presentation. And at the time, we really didn't know what good looked like. We didn't really know what we wanted to do or how to make Rec Room work on these different platforms. So we were just super experimental. And we basically ended up building sort of a different control scheme for each of the different mini games we built, where you're playing one of our shooting games and it was kind of like playing Fortnite. You play one of our dungeon crawlers and it's kind of like playing Zelda. And you go to one of our social spaces and it's kind of like neither of those things. And we were kind of just throwing spaghetti at the wall. But they were all these sort of third-person game modes, and they were all playable with controllers and with keyboards and mice, that kind of thing. But at the same time, as the company is getting a little bit bigger and the community is getting bigger, we started investing in some more complex mini games. I kid you not, we built and shipped a an entire battle royale as a mini game in Rec Room, which was in hindsight ridiculous that we did that, but we did, and that was a lot of fun. We called it Rec Royale. It was a collection of sort of scouts, like Girl Scout, Boy Scouts, that are going and staying on a national park island. So you would ride a little hang glider down, and there are all of these like refrigerated coolers full of paintball guns that you could find and open up, and the last team standing would win. That was really goofy, but we started to kind of push to the point where these mini games we're making are kind of expensive, actually. And so that sort of Rec Royale was happening at the same time that our sort of user-generated content tools were getting to be pretty good. Here's this kind of terrifying face thing here, but that motion was sort of the first demonstration of using some of the in-game programming and building blocks that we had set out to add to Rec Room to make it possible to do complicated stuff. And so we're at this sort of inflection point where, hey, it's getting really, really, really expensive for us to add new mini games. And all of a sudden, the quality of things that we're getting from the community is going up and up and up and up. And so we start to kind of recognize this reality of, hey, Rec Room doesn't have to just be a VR game with content made by us. It can be this sort of cross-platform game with content made by the community. So as we rolled into 2019, that's really sort of where we pushed. We focused a lot on taking a really serious stance on what we call our screens mode, and really figuring out sort of a responsible and productive way of making that game mode work. We, at the very, very end of the year, actually launched on mobile. So one of the big changes we made to screens was we went from third person everywhere and kind of these very disparate control schemes to first person everywhere, and a pretty consistent control scheme across the entire game, because we wanted players to be able to consume and enjoy and create all the same content made by the community, no matter what platform they're on. And so it couldn't be a requirement that every new room that someone makes, they're also investing 500 hours in an entirely new gameplay style that they don't have the capacity to build. So we needed to find a way to make the stuff people were making in the community, the stuff players are making in the community, just work. And so a lot of these steps, like moving to first person, were a part of that process. Also, you'll notice at the bottom here, we keep accumulating platforms the whole time. Every year, we're adding more and more and more and more. And so at this point, not only are we on a bunch of existing VR devices and we're on PC and PlayStation, the Oculus Quest 1 comes out. We launch on iPhone. All of a sudden, Rec Room, this game that was built for high-end $1,000+ PCs with giant NVIDIA graphics cards, is now running on, a Oculus Quest, which is at the time, not even the newest mobile hardware, rendering at 72 hertz with 2 eyes. It's a pretty big jump in terms of required performance. And so this year was really a big sort of cleanup year for us, where we did a lot of work to make sure the screens mode was a strong foundation for us, but also sort of technically make sure the game was capable of running on all these sort of new devices. And both of those together opened up this pathway for us to be on iPhones. So I've got another quick video here that sort of just demonstrates a little bit of what the iPhone experience is like. I know you've all played VR games before. And so this was a video we put out back at the end of 2019 that was sort of just running through a bunch of our rooms that we had made. So this is like our laser tag. This is our paintball. And we really focused on making this mobile experience feel first class. Wanted it to feel like a mobile game, or Fortnite on phones, as opposed to something kind of janky. And overall, I think we did an okay job. It's not the most janky thing in the world, but considering all the complexity we had, I'm pretty happy with the progress that we made. And so you can see here, there are on-screen controls for various different actions. So you've got a button for shooting a gun, and a button for jumping, and a little virtual joystick for walking. And so we found ways to sort of translate all of those pieces of the screens experience, of the VR experience, into a form factor that made sense on a phone. All right. All right, lastly, end of our story here before we get into more interesting stuff. Rec Room in 2020 and 2021, so most recently, sort of throughout the pandemic, we thought of Rec Room as solidly being this cross-platform game. It's solidly filled with user-generated content. The vast majority of what players are doing in the game is playing through rooms and games made by people in the community. We still make some of our own here and there, but the vast majority of the time is spent in stuff we didn't make. And so we're really focused on solidifying that foundation, making sure that our different platforms are as well supported as possible, and that, you know, and then kind of building on top of that foundation and adding in some new capabilities. So we've got some fun stuff we launched recently where we added cars and driving for the first time. And we've got this little dragon here is a costume made by someone in the community that we added support for sort of full bodies. Before, everyone in Rec Room was just a floating head and hands because it was a VR game from 2016 and everyone was a floating head and hands. And so for the first time, we've got, you know, animated feet and knees and legs, and we've built it in a ways that creators can make compelling content. They can make characters like this without having to worry about the kind of hardware that someone's using. It doesn't matter whether you're playing on a phone, you've got legs that work. All you have to worry about is deciding, where does this part of the leg go? Where does this joint go? That kind of thing. And then you'll see the bottom, we sort of have gotten to our most contemporary set of platforms. We added support for Xbox, we added support for Android. And in both cases, these were largely technical challenges. We had to make sure that shaders compiled and the game runs and all that kind of stuff. But we had laid the foundation for the game experience on controller already and the game experience on phones already, that we were able to sort of add another instance to an archetype, not new archetypes altogether. Excellent. So, all right, that's sort of the history. That's the path we've gone down. We started really small, just a collection of small games that we built. Over time, we added on more and more platforms. We went from PC to PC and console. We added support for different types of devices, not just VR, but VR and controllers and keyboards and eventually touchscreens. Oh, Google Slides, why are you doing this to me? There we go. Touchscreens, and really made this transition from a collection of professionally made mini games to a collection of community made content, where we've built the tools for building the content as opposed to the content itself. And so you might be wondering, all right, that's great. I see that you did all that stuff, but how did you do it? Like, what was your thought process along the way? And it really kind of comes down to our design strategy again, where we really kind of kept these sort of three things in mind. We always started with goals. We believe that iteration is quality, and we listen to our players. You'll notice that there wasn't this one moment where it's like, oh yeah, we shipped it and then it was great. And this is exactly went from no VR to, it went from VR only to screens and VR. We did everything wrong you could possibly imagine. For years, we built so many versions of controller-based Rec Room that we ended up shipping to people who played and then said it was not good, and then we tried something else. And this process continued for a really, really long time before we got to the place that we are today. So, you know, we did a lot of iteration and a lot of listening to our players. So to take you kind of to the contemporary way that we think about this stuff, here's an example of these goals I was talking about. There are a million ways that you could make Rec Room work or any game work on a different kind of device. And it really depends on what you are trying to accomplish. You know, what the right outcome or the right approach really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And for us, what we wanted was to make each of our different sort of gameplay platforms as capable as the others. We want to make sure that when somebody makes a cool trampoline room that they built in VR for their friends in VR, someone who has never met that player can discover the room on their phone and still have a good time. And that means that the kinds of things that that player on their phone can do, can experience, need to be pretty dang similar to the kinds of things that a player can do and experience in VR, despite the really significant difference in device capabilities, right? You know, a tracked HTC Vive controller is very, very different from an iPhone SE touchscreen. It's very, very different from a PlayStation controller. But nevertheless, that was our goal. That's what we really needed to make sure happened. We needed to make sure that the outcomes were consistent. We also really wanted to make sure that the experience of playing Rec Room was really high quality on each of these different devices. It's not really good enough for us if you can technically play on your phone, but nobody ever would want to because it was clunky and confusing. And that's kind of diametrically opposed to the first goal. We want something that's going to be sort of very, very cross-platform and platform agnostic, but also sort of playing to the strengths of an individual device and feels familiar for players on that kind of device. And then lastly, cross-platform games are really complicated. There's a ton to manage. Games are already complicated, but you know, going back to our list here, there's some amount of code for every single one of these specific devices. There's a considerable amount different between the console experience and the VR experience, not to mention the VR walking or the VR teleporting or the different locomotion modes, all these kinds of things. Because iPhone is not just iPhone, it's also iOS is not just iPhone, it's also iPad. And so you have different layouts of your UI and how do you make menus that are going to scale? Like there's so much complexity in cross-platform games that is sort of the key challenge to overcome, that we had to find some sort of solution so that we weren't completely bogged down. And so at a high level, this is what we did for Rec Room. We started by looking at all of the different platforms that we're on, and we came up with these sort of gross buckets. We said, really, we're going to say all VR is the same. And there's going to be some differences here and there. The capabilities of a PlayStation Move controller just really aren't as good or aren't as high fidelity as the capabilities of an Oculus Quest 2 controller, but they're pretty close. Then we're going to say, hey, we got another bucket, which is all of the things we call screens. So controllers, playing on an Xbox, playing on a PlayStation, playing on a PC with a controller, playing on a PC with a keyboard and mouse. They're all pretty dang similar. Yeah, there are some differences here and there. Keyboard is more different from an Xbox controller than a PlayStation controller is. But in contrast to VR, it is a pretty solidly different bucket. And then the same thing is true again for touch controls. There are these sort of three pillars that we can think about. And what that let us do was reduce the complexity from 8 platforms to 3. And as we add more in the future, as long as we're not adding another archetype, as long as it's not VR screens, touch, and you know, watches or something, then we can kind of bucket that new platform into these existing archetypes, and it can be a lot cheaper to release on that platform, which is what we did here with the Xbox and Android. We already had this screens, already had this touch. So that means we can think about the play experience from 3 different perspectives: VR, screens, and touch. And then what we did is we looked at kind of the landscape of what exists in Rec Room. What are the things that we have to make sure work on all these different kinds of platforms? And it really boils down to, again, conveniently, 3 really big buckets. We think that Rec Room has avatars, it has objects, and it has rooms. And what I mean by those 3 things are, if I start in the opposite direction, rooms are contexts, rooms are spaces, rooms are sets of rules. If you have a paintball room, then it's the collection of environments that you move through. It's the place where a flag for capture the flag might spawn. We even say that things like the rule set of the game is over when someone scores the flag 3 times are part of the room. Then we have objects, which generally are things that players are capable of interacting with directly. In the case of paintball, it'd be paintball guns, it would be the flag, it would be, you know, grenades. And then avatars are sort of the representation of the player themselves in the space. And the observation that we made was that what we think we can make true is we can make objects and rooms 100% platform agnostic. And so what that means is that if you think about building something like a paintball gun, that it can be all of the logic, all of the design, all of the code for a paintball gun can be focused on what happens when someone pulls the trigger on a paintball gun. How do I fire a projectile? What happens when my projectile hits something? And similarly, all the logic for something like capture the flag can be what happens when a flag is grabbed by a player? What happens when a flag reaches its destination? What happens if my team's flag is not at its destination when you capture your flag? All those kinds of things. And all of those rules can be platform agnostic rules. It's not what happens in VR when you pull the trigger. It's what happens when a player pulls the trigger. It's not what happens on a phone when someone brings the flag to the goal. It's what happens when a flag reaches the goal. And the added benefit of all of that stuff is if we can make objects in rooms truly platform agnostic, then people, our creators in the community who make stuff, can make objects in rooms, which are the sort of intuitive primitives of the universe that people want to make. People want to make a sword. People want to make a game. And they don't really want to think about, well, okay, I've got this sword. How exactly does it work on a Samsung Galaxy whatever? Like, no, just if you have a sort of abstract set of interactive rules that all objects use, then you can make more stuff that are objects, that are rooms, and they'll work on every platform. What that means, though, is that this avatar, the third category here that actually uses these objects, that actually navigates the rooms, is hyper platform specific. And so our strategy here is to kind of take on that responsibility as the creators of Rec Room, the platform. We provide an avatar to VR players and an avatar to screen players and an avatar to touch players that are capable of doing a consistent set of things so that when any kind of avatar interacts with a paintball gun, something sensible happens. When they interact with a sword, something sensible happens. And so here's sort of an example of that. We have this little tutorial experience when you first start playing. You go through sort of a new player orientation. And one of the first things we ask you to do is just to toss some dodgeballs around. And so here's a video, a GIF I captured of someone playing through in VR from the video I found. And you can see here, it's like pretty clearly VR, right? The hands are pretty expressive. They toss the object from their left hand to their right hand. But really what we want to make sure is as capable as, or as possible, is that every player on every platform can pick up these balls, they can throw them, they can hit these standees, and when they hit the standees fall over. Okay, VR, there you go. Well, here's screens. On screens, you'll notice there's more stuff here on the screen. There's some UI telling players what buttons do what. You have to use a slightly different mechanism for determining which objects you want to interact with. There are animations that we've created that represent some of the things that VR players can do, but the outcomes are the same. The screen player is able to pick up the ball, the screen player is able to throw it. When they throw it and they hit the standee falls down. And then lastly, you get touch. And again, it's different, right? The UI is different. The sort of interaction paradigm is slightly different. The way you move around is slightly different, but the outcomes, again, are the same. The space is the same. The objects are the same. And so when you then get 3 players in this room together and they're on different devices, they can all do the same stuff, or at least a close enough approximation that they can have a good time together. And so this really is sort of our approach. We have this different set of controls and feedback that we call our avatar. It's like the suit that the human player gets into so that they can experience the world of Rec Room. But then everything else outside of that suit doesn't really care what kind of suit you have. They don't care if you're in a VR suit or you're on a phone suit. Like, it doesn't matter. You're able to grab objects, you're able to throw objects. Objects do the same stuff when they're thrown. Doesn't matter whether it was thrown by a VR player or a screens player. And so really this kind of comes from the same device. Like, we had these goals, right? Like, we built this version of cross-platform because our goal was people can have the same outcomes. It would be totally reasonable for someone to have a very different goal where they say, no, the VR player is going to be this sort of omniscient, godlike character that moves objects around for the screen players to have to jump around. Like, that's a totally fine game design. That's not ours, right? And so it would have been inappropriate for Rec Room if it was like, well, the only way you can play on a screen is if you're a little tiny person who runs around, who jumps on the hand. Like, that would be a kind of a weird fit. But it's a weird fit because we have these goals. We have these specific things that we want to accomplish. And then, getting to this place, this is the end of a very long journey, and we're still, improving and iterating on it all the time. It took a couple of years of just sort of trial and error and lots of failure for us to get to a place where you could do largely the same things. We had to invest in animation tools and all kinds of stuff, right? And then lastly, we really did listen to our players. And where we got to here is based largely on feedback that we got, both from analytics, what people actually do, and from user testing, and from just listening. And so, this is sort of my advice for all of you as you think about building cross-platform games. Like, really start with the goals. Give yourself permission to iterate. Don't expect you're just going to jump to the perfect solution right away. I mean, it is entirely possible, I guess, logically, conceivably, that you could, but I'm certainly not smart enough to do that. And so I have only really been able to find success by making lots and lots of iterations, and then get feedback from people. And so really, this isn't even really cross-platform design advice. This is kind of just the game design advice. Start with goals. What are you doing? What are you making? This is the best way I've found to get a group of people to agree on what they're going to go do together. Get as many iterations in as you possibly can. And then, hey, you know what? I now acknowledge that Rec Room is special. We have a lot of opportunity to get advice from people, get feedback from people that are really playing the game. But no matter your project, you can get real feedback from real people. You can always find somebody. You can ask someone on, you can go to the dude and find some random person trying to study and annoy them and make them play your game if you wanted to. Like, you can find someone to give you feedback, and getting that feedback early from real people and getting it often from real people is extremely valuable. So that's kind of that. I've taken you through about an hour of a little history of Rec Room and how we kind of approach cross-platform, how we think about it. And so Mitchell can tell me how much time we have left, but however much we do, I want to spend just answering whatever questions you have. And I also want to make a plug for recroom.com/careers. We're hiring a ton of people. We would love for you to come work with us. Please check out the website. Please check out the jobs. I counted something like 55 open positions this morning, so tons of hiring. And if you haven't played Rec Room and you want to check it out, go to this website here, rec.net/download, has links to all our different platforms. And if you want to reach me for any reason, here's my email and my Twitter. I don't know how to do a LinkedIn link on a PowerPoint presentation, so there's my name again. But you can reach me there too. So I'll take a pause there, drink some water. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat, so we can start with those. And if anyone has like any additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or even just kind of like, I guess, react in some way. Yeah, raise your hand like how Joe's doing, and we can get to you for whatever question you have.
Sounds good. Let's see, chat. Hello. I'm gonna move it over here.
So the first one you answered, I'm wondering if you can talk more about how the communities on Rec Room are growing, what your analyses have told you about if people are bringing their real friends, if people are looking to find friends, how does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, what kind of growth does the Rec Room community experiencing? And then sort of how do we learn that? Is that right?
Yes.
Cool. So all kinds of growth, mostly throughout the lifetime of Rec Room, it's been what we would call organic growth, which is to say someone who plays Rec Room tells their friend to check it out, and then they tell their friend to check it out, and they tell their friend. And that has been really productive for us. You're much more likely to keep playing a game to kind of look past some rough edges or something if your friend invited you to play and you get to spend time with them. And so we're really definitely fortunate to have a lot of that organic growth happening. It doesn't happen equally across different platforms though. So we can see that the amount of that kind of organic growth you get is greater in VR, and which kind of makes sense because Rec Room is a greater percentage of the VR community broadly than it is the mobile gaming community. And so we've definitely started to focus more of our efforts and our time on sort of non-organic growth, getting people to join the community because they saw an ad or something like that, which is really not something that we spent any time or money focusing on for a number of years. And largely the way that we identify that is we have a ton of analytics. So since day one, we've had lots and lots and lots of analytics that share what people are doing and where they're spending their time and how many sessions and the kind of relationships they have. That doesn't give you, perfect information about how a relationship started necessarily, but you can kind of glean some trends from that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Next question. Did I get to all of your questions, Patrice?
Yes, thanks.
Excellent. All right. What do you think the future of the VR XR metaverse looks like? I think personally that the aspect of Rec Room that I have been the most inspired and motivated and confident in is just the power of real-time sort of direct social communication and social interactions. And so I think that largely, for me personally, the metaverse is going to be about spending time with other humans that our brains don't think is different or lesser than actual in-person interaction. I think it is a legitimate substitute for the kind of natural human-to-human interaction that we experience in the real world. And I think that because I've experienced that a lot in Rec Room, I have experienced that with the community in Rec Room that's formed. There are lots of players who have made very good friends. Like I mentioned, we've had weddings, like a lot actually of weddings in Rec Room, these lifelong relationships that get built. And, at least sort of anecdotally, I think that you experience, you kind of make memories in a way in Rec Room that you don't, or in XR broadly, I should say, that you don't in other kinds of media. Like if you compare something like a conversation with an acquaintance on Twitter versus a conversation with an acquaintance in Rec Room, one of them feels like a real conversation. One of them feels like a real relationship. When you go on an adventure together, you really remember that you went on an adventure together more than you remember, oh, that was that time we played VR together. Like, no, it was that time where I was with my brother-in-law. I went to the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids thing and we had a fun time and I high-fived and all that kind of stuff. Like, and so that's the place where I'm coming from, where I think creating that opportunity to have these really real, very human, very memorable experiences and relationships is really what the metaverse is going to be providing. And so what I have been most surprised by is not just that, is that you can actually create a lot of that same value through sort of non-XR immersive game-like experiences. I think things like Fortnite are great at this. I think things like Roblox are great at this. I think things like Rec Room on a controller is really great at that. And so where I had come from is like, okay, this totally makes sense. We're two people in VR together. We can go hang out and play disc golf and have a real human relationship and a real human connection. You can actually have a pretty dang close analog if you are playing a game with a controller, that your brain can be present even though it doesn't really think that you can be socially present even though it's not convinced that you're in this space. And so I think that the near-term version of the metaverse probably looks a little less like everyone's in a VR headset all the time, and more of people are spending lots and lots of time together in shared synchronous real-time spaces, things like Rec Room and Fortnite and Roblox. And I think over time, as adoption of that kind of platform continues, you'll see additional adoption of XR because it is better, it is more immersive, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Does that make sense at all? Yeah.
I was just gonna say we have a couple of people who have their hands raised, so I think that we should probably get to them before we get to the next.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So we're gonna ask Bella to please unmute and share whatever your question is.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
So I was wondering, so when you were getting version 1 out the door, you said it took like 3 months. I was wondering, how do you balance like trying to get like a bare bones version out the door with your iterative process? And did you say like how many of the goals you had at the beginning of the 3 months, like did you meet at the end, or did you change them and stuff like that? And like what if like it wasn't working out? Would you have to extend that, or would you just stick closer to your original idea and just get anything out the door?
Yeah. At the time, one of our goals was get something out the door as soon as possible. Like that was honestly goal number one. And so we definitely compromised a lot. Like we read a book called The Lean Startup by, I'll find the author, I forget, but there was an anecdote that that has stuck with me, which is if you're building sort of a min viable product and you're not slightly embarrassed about the quality, you've probably spent too much time on it. And so, what we ended up shipping as professional game developers with, a cumulative many decades of experience all as a group, we were kind of embarrassed, like, it's kind of janky, it's kind of full of bugs. But, what we were able to do is really focus on the core of, we're going to create these social spaces. The game of dodgeball was not good, but it was good enough. You could pick up the ball and you could throw it, and they were like weird networking artifacts. And so we compromised a lot on that kind of fidelity, that kind of quality of like, oh, you can get into weird ties with dodgeball pretty often, but that core of like, I can have a voice chat communication with someone, I can look them in the eye and it feels like I'm looking in the eye, like that stuff we weren't willing to kind of compromise on. So there's sort of this bar, I think, where you're going to have features that are really, really critical. You're just not min viable if this stuff doesn't exist or doesn't sort of meet some quality bar. And then there's a lot that is not in that bucket, that doesn't have to be that good. And it can be kind of painful to hold yourself to that. And you kind of have to cut deep a little bit to understand what really, really matters and what doesn't. But that kind of goal process is intended to be a way to help make it a little bit easier, help identify like, is it really, really, really a goal that this thing is true? And is it really worth all of these other things? Yeah. Eric Rees, thank you, Patrice.
Yeah, and then Joe, if you could ask your question. I think that you should be, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Josh. My question was basically just if you could talk a little bit more about what your thought process was for, I guess, just like leaving industry and just starting something completely new by yourself. Was it mainly like the idea that was really attractive to you of like, creating Rec Room, or was it just like, I really want to do something and it doesn't matter what? Yeah, just more of your thought process. I'd love to hear.
Sure. Yeah, for me, it was the team that I was working with, the group of folks that we were going to leave, that we sort of left together and started this company. And it was just a group that I really liked working with, that I worked well with, that I wanted to keep working with. And honestly, at the time, it was made a little bit easier for us because our HoloLens group was getting shifted around, and the term is reorganized into a bunch of different stuff. And so, there was a bit of activation energy provided there. But, honestly, we didn't know what the idea was going to be. We didn't know it would be Rec Room. We knew it was going to be something XR. We knew it was going to be something like a platform. We kind of had these very high level goals, but we kind of figured out all the details along the way. And what I was attracted to was a team that was going to think like that. A team that was not going to be precious, that was going to be focused on the right thing for the product, the right thing for the business, the right thing and as we grew for the community, and not just like, no, dang it, I'm the director and I said it's got to be this thing. This is my vision. Like, there's a time and a place for that, but that was not what I was looking for, and that wasn't this team. So yeah, really, it was not that we had a really, really strong vision for what Rec Room the product would be, but more that we had a really strong group of effective collaborators. And I kind of thought that no matter what we built, it would probably be about the best use of time that I could think of.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, we had a question in chat from George. Do you ever find your designs for VR experiences being limited by being a cross-platform service? For example, are there ever instances of not implementing a feature / interaction for VR because there's not a good way to implement the same feature on other platforms? I think this is definitely a trap that you can fall into. It is definitely possible to end up building sort of the lowest common denominator game. I think that we have generally done a pretty good job of avoiding it, but a lot of that comes from the fact that our feature set was pretty complete for VR before we ever started building features for other devices. And so for a lot of that initial sort of work of building out the screens version of Rec Room, it was almost as much an effort of porting as it was anything else. And actually, fast forward to today, we're sort of rechoosing some of those legacy features that have been a part of the VR experience from the beginning, because they are really costly for players on touch. Like, there are lots of things that are intuitive and natural in VR that are surprising for a person on a phone. There's really, as an example, like you use your menu in Rec Room by looking at your watch, like a wristwatch, which feels pretty natural, and it's relatively easy to say to somebody, look at your wrist. And they're like, what do you mean? Oh, when you're playing a first-person phone game and you say, open your watch menu, and you're like, the hell? Like, there's no natural social connection between watch and menu, right? It's just a gestural input that's relatively straightforward in VR. And so you end up paying a pretty significant cost in terms of confusion on a phone, because what the heck does that mean? So it sort of depends on the scenario, and the stance that we take, which is lofty and not always achievable, but the one we try to hold ourselves to is Rec Room should feel consistent with other games on its particular platform. Playing on a controller should feel reminiscent of other similar controller-based first-person games. And in the places where it's not, it's got to be better, right? So we can't have those cut corners where it's like weird and janky in the places where it's idiosyncratic. The idiosyncrasy has to be better. And so the best example I have of that is we have a really fun waving interaction. So on a controller, you can hold down the bumpers like L1, R1. And then while you're doing that, your joysticks get overloaded to this kind of fun, expressive, like hand motiony thing. And it's a feature that our players use a lot to be sort of social and expressive, where you're walking around and you're like, oh, hey, George. Or you can kind of, dance and do all kinds of stuff, because it is this sort of fun, expressive, one-to-one feeling input. And it's the kind of thing where, at least for me personally, I go and play other first-person games, and I like try to go wave, and I'm like, oh, dang it. I can't do that, right? So that's not always possible, but we try to be consistent with genre conventions as much as possible and find ways to kind of contort the Rec Room idiosyncratic stuff where we can. And when we have to lean into the idiosyncrasies, we basically hold a really, really high quality bar for ourselves.
Thank you.
Not my question. Just want to add to that. But so like you said, you want to prevent idiosyncrasies from happening. What about stuff that's VR exclusive to the point that there's no need to worry about it being phone? Like, for example, haptic feedback on like a whole body system. That kind of stuff I assume is fair game, because it's as of right now, it's imperceivable to see that happening with a phone or even a controller.
Yeah, that is a good clarification. Like in the case of like, so the question was, how do you think about like a haptic suit in VR? Not really a sensible analog on a phone. I'm picturing things like having haptics when you get hit by a paintball in the chest or something. there's sort of two thoughts that come to mind. One is like, we would not want to say you cannot support this because there's no analog on a phone. It's sort of just additive, right? It's a nice to have additional thing for VR players. That being said, because it is only really relevant for a small subset of the audience, we often would not prioritize it. You know, like everything that you build is expensive and you have a limited team always, you have a limited budget always. And so when there is something that is really only going to benefit one platform, you have to kind of think long and hard about whether it's a responsible investment. But there isn't, you know, a dogmatic reason not to do it, as long as it is sort of this additive thing. That make sense, Ken?
Yes, yeah, I got that.
All right. Let's see. Another question in chat. What is the representation of Rec Room players like geographically worldwide? What has been Rec Room's approach to being an open, comfortable, and desirable space for anyone from anywhere in the world? Rec Room is played by players all across the world, from North America, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, honestly, from very almost any country. I'm sure someone from Rec Room has played there, has played Rec Room from there. Primarily, Rec Room is full of English-speaking players from the US, Canada, and Europe, primarily. And part of being open, comfortable, and desirable is actually wrapped up in our solution for matchmaking. So there's sort of this interesting dovetail between sort of maintaining some amount of cultural consistency as well as just networking latency, where it's often a better functional experience to play an online multiplayer game with someone who is closer physically to you than someone who is further away. So we have sort of nudges in our matchmaking system that will bias groups towards sort of physical homogeny. That being said, they're always just nudges. So we don't do anything that in any way, shape, or form prevents people from playing with someone who doesn't speak their language. Candidly, we have not done a great job of localizing Rec Room. Our players have, in a lot of ways. There are some really fun rooms that I have found that are Japanese instruction, or sorry, they're English instruction for Japanese speakers. So there's a relatively large community of Rec Room players in Japan who have made fun rooms where you can kind of get these sort of like diegetic, big physicalized flashcards where a Japanese native speaker can learn the English word for a noun or something. And so, you know, we also have a fairly large contingent of players sort of in Eastern Europe, but it's sort of spread out. And, you know, localization is something that we are sort of considering making additional investments in going forward. But that's sort of where we're at right now. Let's see. Okay, another question in chat. What was expansion like with the team and servers / infrastructure? AAA games nowadays often have server issues or lack of bodies for bugs and patches, but nobody in the video game dev industry I've seen / heard ever talks about how they adapted to these issues and what it was like. That is a good question. We have grown a lot, and we have a dedicated server team with a number of really excellent engineers. We didn't for a long time. We had one guy who was our server engineer for a couple of years. And we just took this problem really seriously. As part of the kind of growth to be on more platforms, especially when we went from VR to VR plus our first console or our first screens experience, we just took that sort of moment in time as an opportunity to try and bolster our services as much as we could. But, you know, it's always sort of these unknowns. You can never be fully prepared for it. You can do things like you can have, automated traffic that kind of mocks up the scenarios you'd get in real life. And you can have gradual rollouts for your new platforms. So you're going to come out on iPhone, you could release in some small regions first and gradually expand to more over time so that you can make sure that the load that you're getting on your servers is responsible and reasonable and manageable. For us, we have sort of had that gradual growth sort of writ large over our whole history, where we haven't had very many of these like overnight, it's 10 times larger. It's, over a number of months, it's actually grown quite a bit, which has made our server management more manageable, basically. And so, it's hard. It is definitely hard to predict. It's hard to fully address. But I think the most important sort of takeaway is just taking it seriously and investing responsibly in your server infrastructure and server team.
So to add to that, then, what expansion, like platform-wise, was the biggest one? Like adding the Quest, then, or adding the PSVR, or adding the Xbox Mobile, etc. Which one was probably the biggest expansion, either server or employment-wise, or both, maybe?
Honestly, all of the ones you mentioned have been pretty large, and I would say that the growth that surprised me the most was Xbox. I had a lot of reason to expect that Quest would be really popular, because Rec Room is a popular VR game. Quest is an exciting new VR platform. We are really, really pleasantly surprised by the growth that we saw on Xbox. And so that was probably the closest to surprising us in terms of server infrastructure. It so happened at the time that we had sort of built out a big enough server team by the time we came out on Xbox that we were able to manage it pretty well. But that was the biggest surprise. All right, talking about expansion / growth, what was the most interesting technical hurdle you had to overcome? Ooh, let's see. I think that probably the most interesting technical hurdle has been getting Rec Room to fit and run on lower spec devices. So I touched a little bit on this earlier, but we went from a PC only game, like a relatively high spec PC only game, to a console game. And in 2017, the PS4 had been out for 4 years. And so, and even when it came out, it wasn't the highest spec hardware around. So there's a pretty big gulf between a top of the line graphics card at the beginning of 2016 and a PS4 in the middle of 2017. And so it just meant that Rec Room didn't run very well, and we had to spend a lot of time optimizing. But a really, really challenging one was the original Oculus Quest. Getting Rec Room to run on there required us to gut the entire rendering system. And so Rec Room is built on top of Unity, a lot of stuff on top of Unity, but there's Unity in there. And at that point, we made a really big investment in something they were calling the scriptable render pipeline. So if you're familiar with Unity, it's game engine, they make it straightforward and easy to add new visible objects that you can see and interact with and all that kind of stuff. And part of that is their rendering system. So how you would display objects and geometry and shaders and materials and all that kind of stuff. And for the longest time, it was sort of just this big black box. You could configure it, you could change the shaders you used, but you really didn't have much control over how things got rendered, sort of technically. With their scriptable render pipeline, they opened that up a lot. They basically had a code layer where you could really define how the renderer worked, how each step handled, how it would decide which objects are going to be rendered and how they're going to be rendered together or not together, or what order, all those kinds of things. And so what we found was that we were really bottlenecked when we tried to run on the Quest 1 by rendering. Just the number of things we're trying to draw, the complexity of the number of vertices, just way, way, way too high. The frame rate was incredibly low. And so we made a really significant investment, maybe like 4 months, I think, of a number of engineers rewriting the entire renderer, focused on making Quest work, rewriting every single one of our shaders that was in the game. This was hundreds and hundreds of shaders, and redoing sort of our whole lighting model at the time. And because we're kind of crazy, we decided that while we're in here, like while we're cracking open the hood of our car, we're going to just make a couple of other adjustments. And we took the opportunity to ship dynamic lights to players on every platform as part of our user-generated content systems. So while we're in there redoing the renderer, we also invested a lot in how can we give creators, even on an Oculus Quest, sort of an arbitrary number of point light spotlights that they can place in their scenes so that they can decorate things and all this kind of stuff. So that was a super fun challenge. It was a little hectic because we were a launch title for the Oculus Quest, which meant we couldn't really miss their launch date. And we have had the luxury of not having too many external deadlines. So that was a bit of a challenge, but absolutely worth it. Quest has been great for us. We're really happy with the work that we got done there. Let's see. All right, question from Ken. How did you guys find the player base that was most important for gathering ideas for features expansion? Having the highest Steam hours or most posts on the social media platform, et cetera, doesn't necessarily mean they're the ones keeping the community going. That's absolutely true. There is definitely sort of a vocal minority. We have a community on Steam, or sorry, on Reddit that's really vocal and active. A community on Discord is really vocal and active. They don't necessarily represent a broad swath of players. Really, this is where analytics and user testing come into play a lot. These players that are really invested definitely can give a strong reaction to sort of general Rec Room taste. Is this going to fit into the universe or not? Is this broadly good or bad? But we had a lot of resistance from our existing vocal Reddit community to adding support for non-VR players. A lot of resistance for a really long time. And at the same time, there was an ever-growing number of non-VR players who are really enjoying the game and building relationships and building memories. And so there was this really clear distinction where we're not seeing these players at all on Reddit. We know that they're spending a lot of time because we have these analytics that demonstrate that they are. We know that they're coming back. We know that they're making friends. They're just not talking on these platforms that we have sort of visibility into. And so it's honestly a challenge, but what our general solution has been to find ways to sort of glean insights from analytics, and then also to run really explicit sort of user testing to when we need to get sort of more information. How are we doing on time? Looks like we're at almost 7 o'clock.
Yeah, I think that 7 o'clock is where we should probably call it. That's where we usually end our meetings. But thank you so much. You've been an amazing presenter, and it's been so awesome hearing from you.
Hey, great. Excellent. Well, I've had a lot of fun. Thank you all so much for having me here. Again, I strongly recommend you check out recroom.com/careers. If you haven't played Rec Room, check it out. If you want to reach out to me, there's my contact info. Would love to hear from you. All right.
Thank you so much for talking to us. We all really appreciate it. This has been probably one of the coolest meetings we've ever had.
Hey, cool. Well, really glad to be here. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye.
Yeah, bye. Bye.